What's up, YouTube? Today I'm going to be painting and upgrading a Han Solo Blaster so it looks a little bit more screen accurate. I mean, it is still a functional Nerf blaster. It doesn't like hack sections out of the plastic or cut off the tactical rail, but it does look pretty good. Much better than in the box, obviously. And I am probably going to use it as a display piece and build a stand. Now, before we go on any further, I want to issue a quick warning, which is mod at your own risk. Mod your Nerf Blaster at your own risk. There's some of these I've taken apart I can't get back together, and I have a box of shells, Nerf shells, the outside parts of the blasters, and another bucket full of springs and such. Not all of that is for me messing them up, but before I really knew what I was doing, most of the time I just used ones I got from thrift stores, so I was only paying $1 or $2. Some of them I only wanted to strip for parts anyways, but mod at your own risk. And the second thing is, I painted this to look very realistic. Okay, this is not something I would take outside and use in like a family Nerf war, or even carry around like outside of a convention. Maybe there, but I wouldn't just go around in public with this because it does look very real. And check with your local law. Sometimes you can get in trouble for painting toy guns to look very realistic. I did not leave an orange tip on this. Like I say, it's not something I would take outside. Now, like this here, all bright orange and blue, that would go outside. This here, I would use this in a Nerf war. Like, you can easily tell that this is a toy. There's not even any metallic anything on it. But yeah, so that's pretty much it for now. And I didn't know if I was going to be able to get a video out, just because of how busy I've been working on my family's costumes for the upcoming convention and commission work. I had to spend a lot of money on my car to get it running, and that's left me kind of broke, so I had to take some commission work ASAP and get that done. But I was able to get this project done, do the video. Hopefully you guys enjoy it. Okay, so recently I had someone commission me to repaint their Star Wars Han Solo Blaster. And this was the end result, and it's pretty cool. He wanted it left essentially like intact, as far as he didn't want me attaching anything to it, and he didn't want me cutting or taking anything off of it. And I had the option to drill out the holes here up front, but I did not, because once you drill out all those holes, if this gets dropped, chipping paint is the last thing you're going to have to worry about. What's going to happen is you could get a crack just straight down through those holes, or just have a chunk break off of it. So yeah, I did leave that the way it was. And upon everyone at work hearing that I had to spend all my savings repairing my car, they went out and bought me this Han Solo Blaster for my birthday. And what I'm going to be doing with this today is painting it much like this, but I'm also going to do some external cosmetic modifications to this, to make it look a little bit more like Han's DL-44. Now, one of the things right off the bat you notice, this is a working Nerf pistol. It has an internal magazine that holds 4 darts, and the Star Wars darts glow, and it has an internal LED that helps to bring, or maybe GUV, I'm not sure, but it brings them to life so that they, leave a green streak flying through the air as you shoot them. I'm going to pretty much leave all this intact, but the scope, for example, I don't want this on top. I want to transfer that to the side. And there's a whole bunch of other fun things I want to do with this to make it look more like Han's while still leaving it to be operable as a Nerf sidearm. I also want to make a holster for this as well that has the signature Han Solo V in it to account for the scope on the side. Trying to holster this thing with the scope on top would be really, really hard. So that's the other reason I need to move the actual scope to the side of the blaster. Alright, so now that it is out of the box, one of the first things I'm going to do is take this apart. If nothing else, just because I am curious what is on the inside. And the first thing I've done is I've used a Phillips head screwdriver to loosen the screw in the battery compartment. That is the first piece of all this that I'm going to remove, along with the batteries. Okay, so I have removed every single screw from this, and every single screw on here is the same exact length, except for the one that goes in this hole right here. This screw is about 1mm or so longer than all these other ones. So I have set it separate. I mean, you can look at it and tell it's longer than the others, but I have set it separate anyways, so that I don't forget, and also filming this so I don't forget. Now, initially, I had intended to just take apart the slide, but one of my buddies told me that probably can't do that because he has the older Han Solo Blaster, and he said that it was somewhat anchored into the shell, and he is unfortunately right. And if you look at this blaster, the reason I'm taking it apart to cut off this scope is because this whole area in here is so tight that I don't feel comfortable trying to use a Dremel or a hacksaw and cut it from the outside without worrying about damaging all this. Now I have epoxy putty and Bondo, and if I would really tear something up, I could fix it, but I don't want to spend the extra time doing it, and I want this to look clean, okay? So, I've already taken the liberty of gently separating the shell pieces, and now, see, the slide is attached to it. At least as far as I can tell. Oh yeah, right there. It is screwed in. Okay, so that explains why the slide just wouldn't come off. Alright. And this is the internals. This here, of course, is the internal magazine. You have your battery compartment here, your soundboard speaker for your pew-pew-pews, different wires running to your different lights throughout this. And what is this? Possibly some kind of lock? I don't know. But I'm pretty sure this is, yeah, this is a floating plunger tube, so I'm not going to upgrade the spring or anything. Like I say, this is also just for cosplay. But now you can see from this back side here, I can map out and easily, or at least much more easily, use my Dremel to cut this. Or even perhaps, no, a hacksaw is not going to work. Going to have to cut it with the Dremel. And once that's cut, I'm also going to have to epoxy putty it closed. But we'll get to that later. First, I'm going to start cutting on this. Before I start cutting on this specific side, I removed the hand grip, and I also removed the slide. And I removed the slide by taking that screw out of there. But I don't want to lose the screw. So the screw is going to go right back where it came. Snug enough that it's not going to slip out. And next, by using the top edges of this here as a guideline, I'm going to draw a line with a Sharpie as just exactly where I need to cut to trim this piece off. Okay, so before I do my line and do my cutting, I decided, you know, I might as well go ahead and take this side off. And you may be wondering, is this side the same? No, it's actually not. First of all, you have this in the way. This is the plunger tube. Inside the plunger tube is a floating plunger head, and here's the actual spring, which gives, you know, the plunger its force to shoot air through there. If you mod Nerf guns or take them apart or tinker with this stuff, this is all things you already know. But you're going to want to very carefully remove this whole entire assembly right here. Alright, now I have very carefully, off camera, teased this out. This is the way it goes with this T in the front and this C on the side and this little line at the end. This is what's going to be facing you. And you'll notice here on the very bottom, in the front here, there is a little tab, a little tooth, right there on the bottom. And you want that facing down. So whenever I pull these parts out, I sit them pretty much the way they have to go right back in. And getting further into this blaster, in order to take this here off, you're going to have to move this slide here very gently back some so that you can expose the screw. And the screw you need to loosen to take this out is right there. It's that black one right there. And you're going to go ahead and loosen that up. And once you get this loose and take it out, this should come right off. Now, as I teased this out, I was very careful not to disturb any of this. Everything's in place. There's nothing I want to remove, and like I said, I want this to work when I put it back together. Also took photos of it to go along with this video, and that way, just in case something gets knocked out of whack, I can put it right back. But always better be safe and sorry. And I was wrong. There wasn't just the one screw. There was a second screw. And whenever I pulled it back far enough to get to that screw, it slid this piece out and knocked the magazine up a little bit, but I just pushed it down and shoved the dart tube right back in. And you don't have to worry about how to align this, because you see on the top here, this hole here was attached to there. Now these two black screws are shorter and different from the others, so what I'm going to do is go ahead and just put them back into both of their respective holes here, and then I'll actually get to the cutting. Okay, so I have both my slide pieces with my replaced screws, and I have drawn my lines where I want to cut this. And as you can probably figure out and see now, I needed the space to use my Dremel to make the cuts, okay? And I have this cutting wheel, which is severely worn, probably unsafe, probably shouldn't use it, don't care using it anyways. And I'm going to run my Dremel around 1750, 18 RPMs, somewhere around there. And very carefully cut both of these pieces off. So I have made my Dremel cuts, and I tried to film a time lapse, but it's 101 degrees outside right now. I'm in my garage, which is not air conditioned, and I imagine it's even hotter than that. I am boiling alive to do this. But anyways, and you're welcome, anybody that's appreciative that I'm boiling alive to do this in my own skin. But yeah, so clipped off both pieces. And of course all this I'm going to clean up with the sanding wheel. But I just wanted to get it off, and I couldn't use a hacksaw or anything else. Possibly a skill saw, but I just don't have one. And this excess here I'm also going to cut and sand off, because I no longer need it. And then this scope, this piece here, will just attach right back into there like that. And I still have the screw hole, so I will put the original Nerf screw back in it to hold it together. We'll of course sand and trim this up, because this is going to be mounted to the side of the blaster and no longer to the top. And next we'll get to... Okay, so I've used my Dremel to sand smooth and even the tops of this here. I'll do a little hand sanding later, but for right now I'm just going to go ahead and put this back together. And I've already put in one of the two screws here, and I also aligned my feed tube here, the tab in the top of the rear slide. First screw is in, second short stubby little black screw is right here. And as you can see, that is quite a tight fit to get that screw in there. Now you may ask yourself, well, why didn't you just take and slide it back a little further? Well, the reason why I didn't slide it back a little further is when you pull this tube back so far, this whole magazine is going to fly apart. If it does, you got to put it back together. And that's going to be the point where if you hadn't taken pictures, you're going to wish that you had taken pictures. Now that that side is back on, and I've slid this back forward into place and everything is intact, I have my plunger tube here, which once again has that little tooth hanging down here on the front, and the T, the C, and the weird little straight bar thingy here, upside down T, I don't know what it is, on the side. And I'm going to gently tease this back in. And once you have the plunger tube back in, this end piece needs to be inside here, holding your spring in place nice and even. This should not flop or wobble if you have it incorrectly. And this little orange piece here is the catch mechanism. It is what locks it in place when you pull it back, so it holds the spring until you pull the trigger. So you need to make sure that's up inside there. Everything should be good and solid. And now I'm going to go ahead and replace the slide from the other side here back onto this one. Okay, now that the piece is back on the other side here, I'm going to go ahead and put the blaster back together. I firmly press everything into place. Put the hand grip section here back in. And once I get this firmly in place and the slides are lined up and everything feels like it's in working order, I'm going to put the screws back in, starting with this extra long center one that goes right in there. that I set aside to begin with, so I don't... Okay, so I have my scope back together. The original factory screw is now in it, as you can see there. The bottom of this is still pretty rough. I don't really feel like taking a Dremel to it, partially because I've, after some thinking and figuring, decided how I'm going to mount this to the side. Initially, I was going to put it like this, because in Han's actual blaster, it is sitting like that. Excuse me. Part of the issue with it is, I want this to still be a working Nerf blaster as well as a cosplay prop. I want it to do both functions. So, with that in mind, I want to have a nice firm contact surface whenever I grab this to prime it and load the blaster. I don't have to worry about this breaking or coming off. And this gives me a nice wide area, once I sand this down, to attach with some 2-part epoxy and some epoxy putty. And that is also going to raise it up slightly as well, off of the side of the blaster. Okay, now that everything is back together, all the lights and everything obviously still work. Got my scope here. Sanded down, pretty good so far. I actually used this old skateboard grip tape. The adhesive on it wasn't great because I let it sit around too long, but the actual surface itself is very rough and will take stuff down quick. It's not good for sanding anything, you know, you want a nice fine finish, but if you just want to take out some burrs real quick, it works. And of course we still have this hole left, and I gotta cover that. And what I have to cover it with is this little piece of plastic here, and this came from just a spare Nerf shell I had from this Doomlands Vagabond that I really don't like in the slightest. Even after modding, I don't like it. I got one that was busted and I just gutted it for parts. But yeah, any spare piece of plastic, toy plastic. I was going to use the 1/8 inch thick acrylic, but the simple fact is I just have a finite amount of it. It is a little pricey. So this thing, you know, was given to me, it was broken. So yeah, I just cut that out. I'm going to use that to cover the actual hole here. However, whenever I glue this, I'm going to first use super glue to attach it. I'm only going to put a little dot on each end here. And that's just to hold the plastic in place. It's not so much going to form a great permanent bond. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come through, put a little bit of epoxy putty and epoxy on one side of it, and then I'll firmly hold it in place nice and flush against here. But I'm not going to glue this side. And the reason is, if this ever breaks or something happens or I want to repaint it, I'll still be able to take this whole thing apart. An epoxy putty stick. And how else to show up in camera? I mean, yeah, you can pretty much see there is a large difference between the color on the outside and the color on the inside. It's 2 parts. So whenever you mix it together in your fingers, it activates and it begins to harden once you end up working with it applied. I think the work time is like 5 minutes or 15 minutes. I'm not sure. Instructions are on the package of whichever one you would purchase. This is a generic one from Harbor Freight Tools, so this isn't even quality, but it works. I mean, I haven't noticed much difference in quality between the ones I pay more for and the ones that I pay less, so whatever. But I'm going to use that to fill this, but I'm also going to use it to fill in this teeny tiny little gap here. And this other little teeny tiny one here just to fill this in, to begin to like fully bond this. Right, so I did a pretty fair job, I feel, of sealing this up here with the, if this will focus, with the epoxy putty. It's not perfect, but of course I am going to sand and smooth this out once it dries and sets. And next I am taking this other wad here and I'm going to work it out and fill that in. Okay, so now that this has sat overnight and the epoxy has filled, I should probably point something out. I'm never really going to see through this again. Although I had zero intentions of actually sighting through this in the first place. If you use Nerf blasters a lot, you'll realize that wherever you're pointing, it may hit a little higher, a little lower, a little left, a little right, or sometimes way off. This can be improved by the AccuStrike darts, but this scope, of course, is entirely for show to begin with, and honestly, having it on top of the blaster is going to kill my sighting anyway, especially since I'm just kind of aiming in a general area. I don't need an actual optic, because Nerf darts just aren't accurate. However, before I go ahead and glue this on, which I'm actually going to have a riser plate to raise it up about 1/4 inch off of here, it's not going to be sitting flush, it is going to be up a bit, but before I do all that, I need to prep all this stuff to be glued and painted, okay? And the first thing I'm going to work on, oopsie, don't die Han Solo Blaster. Okay, it still works. The first thing I'm going to do here is all this writing, all these logos, I'm going to sand it off. I'm going to sand it totally smooth. So I've gone ahead here and sanded off the logos, and as you can see where I've sanded it, it is pretty dull in comparison to all the rest of the plastic. And to get these logos off pretty quick, I used nothing special. Like, this isn't even a brand. This came from the dollar store. It was literally $1 for like all this various sandpaper here. And I just used 100 grit to take it down. Now, the coarser grit, like this 100 grit, is going to leave some lines in it. You may want to use something that's not so coarse, but using 100 grit on all this took me total, I would say, about 20 minutes at least, no more than 30 minutes. So the finer grit that you use to remove these logos, the longer it's going to take, but the smoother it will look. However, after you paint it and... well, because I'm going to put 2 primer coats on it, airbrush it, clear coat it. By the time you get done with that, it usually self-levels out those little scratches. You don't see them much. But if you're real particular, use something more fine. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this 320 grit, 3M sanding sponge. This one I actually did go and pick up at Lowe's and spend a little bit on. Now, I've used this a decent amount, so it definitely isn't as rough as the original 320. It's probably closer to somewhere between like... probably around 5, 6, somewhere around there. But this is going to be used to essentially dull up the rest of the blaster. I am going to sand and press in and get in between every single nook and cranny on this whole blaster to make all of it look dull. And what that is going to do is it's going to help the paint to stick. And I'm using a finer grit because this finer grit, like I say, won't put all the lines into it that the 100 grit will. And of course I am going to resand these areas as well as I'm doing it, so this will get smoothed out some too. But yeah, and also have another sanding sponge here, which is 150 grit, and that'll be for any textured areas. Like this grip is pretty textured. I'm going to use something a little bit more rough on it to help sand it down. But you always want to use finer grit just to dull the blaster. Okay, so I have sanded down the scope and everything, and whenever I hand sand this, the only real pointers I guess I could give is I usually go in one direction. For example, on this part, so I'm going in this direction. And for these pieces that are going sideways, I go sideways, back in the center of the barrel, I'm going this way again. Just went flat across the top. I just try to make it even and consistent. Same thing with the rest of the blaster here. You know, I went through, sanded it all down. Looks pretty good. Now, to mount this scope on, I'm going to use some epoxy and some epoxy putty, much like what I used to fill this. But I don't want it sitting just directly flat on it, because that just doesn't quite look right. I feel like it needs to be at least 1/4 of an inch up. And handily enough, I end up actually having a piece of 1/4 inch acrylic plexiglass. That was just scrap. That was almost square. It was pretty ugly, but I sanded it down. Now you'll notice one side I've already roughed up. And I did that with the Dremel. And this helps the epoxy to bond better than to a smooth surface. This surface I left smooth just to show you. And this may get a little loud. I am going to turn on my Dremel here. I have it at about 1700 RPMs on the adjustment here. And now both sides are nice and roughed up and should bond pretty well. And if you are not removing the scope on your blaster and you're just doing a repaint and you're just going to leave it the way it is with the scope on top here, leaving the Star Wars logo on is up to you. I left the Star Wars logo on because I am going to be covering this up with this piece of plastic and the scope itself. So once I do that, you're not even going to see the Star Wars logo. Now, if you guys follow my Instagram, you might have seen I've already done a repaint of this without removing the scope or anything. That was a commission, and he requested that the scope be left where it was, and that I did not remove the Star Wars logo. But he did want me to remove all the other writings and logos, but he did want the Star Wars left on it. So I left the Star Wars on it. So that's up to you. You can always sand this out with 100 grit or less and get it just as smooth as all the rest of this. Now, if you're not a regular Nerf modder or a regular cosplay, you know, plastic toy gun overhauler, and you haven't done this before, I'm going to give you a quick piece of advice. This had paint on it. You'll notice I took all the paint off. If there's paint anywhere on your Nerf blaster and you're going to paint over it, you definitely want to make sure that you get all that paint off. Because a lot of times, whether I'm using a spray paint or even this Dupli Color vinyl and fabric, which is specifically made and does bond to plastic, especially mold injected like plastics like this Nerf really, really well. Whenever it hits that already pre-layer of paint, for some reason it'll bubble up. I don't know what it is about what Nerf or these companies are using, but you always want to make sure you want to get that paint off. And I took it off here even though I'm covering it up because I don't know how it's going to affect my epoxy bond, and I need that bond really strong because once the scope is back on here, I'm still going to be doing that, you know, to actually prime and fire the blaster. So I don't want this coming off because that would be a big fat fail on my part. Okay, and for this fun part of bonding, I am using epoxy. This is Loctite 2-part epoxy. It's 5-minute set. It's not the instant epoxy, it's the quick epoxy. You'll notice the label isn't on it. I hate it. I end up, as I'm trying to pump it, or pull these plungers back to pull the epoxy back in it, I end up doing goofy stuff, like I don't end up pulling the plunger back and pulling the plastic off. So that's why it's not on there. Otherwise, I just show you the label. But I will put this down in the description, and of course, if I don't, leave a comment and let me know. And you need to mix this on a surface like cardboard. And this, of course, is just a piece of poster board that I've been painting on that I'm using as my work surface. And normally I would just mix this on a piece of scrap cardboard. But for sake of demonstration and doing everything one-handed in a video, I am going to put some epoxy, not too much, because you really don't need a whole lot. You just need enough to cover the surface area. So I'm going to put down that much. I'm going to go ahead and put my cap back on here so I'm not leaking everywhere. And I have this little popsicle stick here, craft stick, whatever you want to call it. And you just mix them together. And you want to mix this together for about 20 seconds. Okay, so that should be good and mixed. I'm going to go ahead and move this to the side here. And I'm going to start just gradually applying and spreading out some of this epoxy here. I'm not going to put too much on the bottom because it will squeeze out and just kind of make a blurry little mess. But I want to have a nice even amount. Stuff like this takes a few times to get the exact hang of. I've modded and done a lot of Nerf guns like this recently. Probably about 30 or so in the last few months. Including some crazy custom builds. Not all of it commissioned, a lot of it actually for myself. Some of it just commissioned for friends. Because my friends have been getting into Nerf and Nerf modding, and they want to start a local Nerf club, which would be awesome. Okay, so that has been positioned with the epoxy there. Now, next what I'm going to do is find something, I don't know what, but something that has a little weight to sit on it to hold it in place. It needs to be held in place for at least 5-10 minutes, then you can take the weight off of it. I would recommend, if you have the time, leave it there for a full half hour. Within about an hour, it is fully cured, but I would wait at least 24 hours before you use it, okay? You want to make sure it's fully cured and fully set, or it may just break right off and you have to do this all over again. And that is definitely not any fun. Now, some of this excess epoxy here, I am going to be scraping up and just kind of running along the side here so that I can fill in the little gap between the edge of this and the actual base of the priming mechanism on the blaster. Just like that. I'm going to go ahead and smooth this out off camera and then scrape and wipe off some of the excess that I've slopped here. And then we'll come back and glue on the top part. The 20 seconds mixing my epoxies is essentially the same thing I'm going to do as before, where I just take some of my epoxy and I'm going to spread it out here onto this. Put it a little bit thicker on this, just because the bottom of that scope where I crammed all that epoxy putty into is pretty smooth, but it sure as heck ain't perfect, you know? I want to make sure this has a nice, good seal. I got enough to get in the nooks and crannies and all that good stuff. And the rest here at the very bottom, I'm just going to spread out nice and smooth to help fill in some of those chunky areas and make it easy to sand. Okay, and the way I'm going to place the scope is at the top of my 1/4-inch thick plexiglass. Not quite in the middle of the scope itself. And I want this nice and even. Make sure it's lined up, because once this epoxy sets, There is no unsetting. Once it is set, it is set. It ain't moving. You got what you got. And that is it. Okay, so that looks pretty good all around. I'm going to let that sit overnight for 24 hours. Actually, hold up here. I'm going to let this sit for an hour. I'm going to put something on it again to weight it down. This is going to be a little more tricky to find something to put on. I have to find something that I can balance over it, I think, right at the point where it lines up with the contact. But once this sets for an hour and I know it's held firmly in place, I'm going to come back through with some more of this liquid epoxy that I have over here, and I'm going to turn the gun upright and put a little extra around all the seams where I glued, anywhere I can get my stick in there to get it in there. And then it'll basically form what is called a plastic weld. I already have the glue to bond the two surfaces together, but whenever you seal around the edges where you glued, I'm pretty sure they refer to that as a plastic weld or an epoxy weld. Okay, I wasn't going to film this, but just to show you guys what I just explained, probably way too much detail to come back and show you. And very carefully scooping up small amounts of this and just gently guiding it in there to fill in that seam. Filling the seam in. And give you a nice, strong, assured, and guaranteed bond. Like I say, I'm not going to be using this in a Nerf war. This is just for cosplay, but the simple fact is I want it to be stable. I don't want to have to repair it. And, well, once it's glued, I want it to stay glued. But I do not want to repair it. And I do not want to have it break on me at a convention or in my home or really anywhere. It must be a nice, good, strong, solid bond here. And once this epoxy sets, it is much like a resin, where it is pretty much just like plastic. Now, I could use the same epoxy putty that I used to fill that gap for all this, and you can use that at home as well if you have that. The reason why I'm not is the epoxy putty I feel like is a little bit more brittle, and this stuff is slightly more flexible and holds up just a little bit better with things like abuse. I use this on my Franken Blaster, which is a modern version of Wacom S7's Hellsunder, and if you'd like to check that out, that is on my secondary channel, Zolus BTS. Now that I've done the bottom, I went ahead and repeated the same process on the top here and put and spread out a nice even layer of epoxy over all my seams between the original shell and the actual 1/4 inch acrylic plexiglass insert and the scope itself. And once this sets, I'm going to go ahead and repeat this on both sides, this side and this side as well, as much as I can get in there on the inside. I was real careful to get it as flush and even as I could up here on the epoxy, because whenever I go to sand this, I don't want to have to sit here and try to sand forever to get, to make it look smooth and nice. So I did spread out the epoxy as even as possible on both this top area here and also on the bottom. Like I say, you can avoid a lot of this like unevenness and such and give yourself a little bit less sand time just by using the epoxy putty. But like I say, I just don't personally feel like it is as good at bonding as this is. And also, I'm also just using this regular old Loctite. I'm pretty sure this is 2400 psi. Probably way more than enough you're going to need for like cosplay use and not like rough, like actual play with the material. But they also make JB plastic weld, which I think is 3400 or 4400 psi, which is even better than this. It smells way worse, so I'm certain that extra chemical is doing something in there. I don't know, but yeah, it's pretty rad. Already my epoxy has had the 24 hours to dry, and I went through and just double checked everything and sanded everything down, including the epoxy edge, or at least the two that I could get to. This top one, first of all, needed to be just smoothed down and evened out, and it has been. and I worked from a rougher grit down to a 600 to get it as smooth as possible. Also sanded the other underside as well. What didn't work is getting that quite as smooth, but still doesn't look bad. And now that I've gone over the whole thing, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to paint this with a primer. Now, a lot of the war blasters that I put together and take apart and all that you may see on Instagram, you notice I take the shells apart. But this is a purely cosmetic paint job. And what I mean by that is, I'm not just doing it to be rough and tumble and for function, but so that it looks good whenever everything is done. So I'm not going to disassemble it to paint it. I'm actually going to paint it whole. And the one thing I am going to do is I'm going to shove a plastic bag down in here to make sure that no paint gets inside the barrel. You also want to make sure that your top slide here is all the way forward so that you're not getting paint in your LED area. If you want to cover this, you can. I think these light bars look cheesy. Once I painted the other one and pulled the trigger, you could still see the lights, but just barely in these thin little red lines that actually looked like, I don't know, like there would actually be like heat vents or something. So I'm not going to match that either. And on his blaster, he's very particular about the sound and everything working. So I did cover this with a piece of tape for the initial primer coats. This one I'm not going to. I'm just going to go light there and pay attention to it and try not to get too much down inside that speaker and soundboard or whatever's in there. And for the first couple primer coats I'm going to put on this is Dupli Color Vinyl and Fabric Specialty Coating. I usually pick this up at, oh look, it's a moth. Great. Anyways, I usually pick this up at AutoZone. This is sold, marketed for, you know, doing the interior of your car, but it bonds really well to this mold-injected plastic that a lot of spray paints don't bond the best to. Some do, some don't. Some say this isn't necessary and this stuff is a waste of time, but my own personal experience is this stuff works great, especially as a primer. Doesn't matter what color you have. This one is a charcoal gray. They come in all different colors. I've heard that the darker ones, like the grays and the blacks, work the best. I used the normal gray and I've used the black, and this time I'm going to experiment with the charcoal gray and see how all that works out. Just a wire through here because I am going to basically hold this up with one hand and paint it with the other. But first here on camera, I just wanted to show you how this stuff looks. If you haven't used it before and you're not familiar with it, it's thinner, I feel, and more wet than spray paint. And you don't want to put too much on and get it to run. So I usually just do some pretty thin light coats. Okay. Which is much slower and much more careful than I generally go with spray paint. Okay? But, of course, you can see as you go to the side, there's a lot of orange and spaces I didn't get. But like I said, I'm going to hang this up, coat the rest of it, let that dry, get it a second coat, and then we'll come back and start working on the rest. Alright, after just a couple of coats of this vinyl dye, this thing already looks so much better. Now that my several coats of the vinyl dye primer are done, I'm going to go ahead and use my airbrush. I'm going to put in some Cratex opaque black, and I mix this stuff with water. About 50-50 with water, and add a little bit of Mod Podge to it too to make it a little bit glossy. My air compressor is on. If you're wearing headphones, just make it loud. You've been warned. And here we go. Okay, so there it is. It has a nice slick black wet coat on it. I'm going to go ahead and let this dry, then paint the other side. And I'm going to do at least 2 to 3 coats of the black on this till it's nice and even. I have, of course, painted the entire thing, several coats of black, allowed it to dry. Now, what I'm going to do is start working on the main body of the blaster and the scope and all this stuff in here. Because, well, at least from the photos that I can see, and I'm pretty sure it was from an actual prop weapon originally. Actually, I'm not pretty sure, I am sure. But it has sort of a blued look like an actual firearm. And if you know what blued steel is, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't, you can just Google it, blued, B-L-U-E-D, steel. And what I've done is I've taken some black and some dark blue, a touch of white to tone down the black a bit, and a little bit of water and some odorless mineral spirits to thin it down. And that gave me, after trial and error and adding a little bit of this and a little bit of that back and forth between the black and the blue and how thin I wanted it, I ended up coming up with something that I liked. And originally I used this on a Judge Dredd Lawgiver in a video a while back. Now I'm going to turn on the air compressor and spray a little of this out, show you what it looks like. So I don't know how well that color shows up, but you can see it's not like a true black. You know, it's got that blued to it. But I don't want to put too much of it on. If I put too much of it on, then it just looks fake. So I just want to do it nice and thin like that, right there. Not too much at once. Now, I'm not sure how well that's even going to show up on camera. I mean, it kind of does. You can see a contrast between this and this now. You can see how this has a darker black and this has just a shade off. And that's pretty much exactly what I'm going for. I'm going to let that dry, flip it over, do the other side, we'll come back and move on with the painting. Alright, now that has had a chance to dry, you'll notice that I had left the muzzle here that nice gloss black, and I done all the rest of this with the bluing, and that's because this gloss black is going to serve as the base for this Wicked Silver from Createx Colors. Turn on my airbrush. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I've taken my Wicked Silver and I've thinned it out pretty considerably so that whenever I'm spraying this on, it's quite thin and I can layer it on and control how thick it goes. And the whole point or idea here, of course, is I want to put enough silver on here that it looks metallic, but not too much that it ends up looking cheesy, if you know what I mean. I want it to have a metallic look, but not too much. So I'm going to go ahead and continue to layer this on. I'm also going to paint these couple wheels and a few other spots on here as well with the airbrush. I've gone through and done up my silver and put some spots here and there for wear and things like that. Next, what I did was I took this Tester's blue, opaque blue, and I added some lighter blue and some eggplant purple to it and thinned it out pretty thin. And the end result you'll see here kind of has that light blue color. And what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to lightly put a band of this. Just a tiny thin little amount right through the center there. So much that you can just barely see it except for whenever the light catches it. I'm going to continue to follow this band around to the backside. Now I have a bit of Wicked Gold loaded up. And much like with the silver and the blue, it is of course thinned out very thin. You can see here as I spray it, it's not a very thick, heavy stream. So I'm going to take this, and much like the blue, just put a little bit on the end there. I'm going to follow that around, and I'm also going to put a little bit of the gold into this as well. And I'm going to come back with the silver again. I'm going to overspray it and blend the two together a little bit. Alright, I did my gold and blended the gold and the blue in by just spraying a little, very light amount of silver over it. Also put a little bit of my gold over the silver here and here to give it kind of that weathered, aged, kind of sad, beat up look. Now I have some moccasin brown, which is not even airbrush paint, but it has a nice thin light brown color, and the less you put on over the black, of course, the more okay, so they're just a little bit at a time. I just kind of puffed it on around there. And obviously the more you put on, the lighter brown it is, and the less you put on, the darker it is. And I'm going to go ahead and do the other side. And now that I have, for the most part, all the airbrush work done, I'm going to start doing some hand-painted details. One thing I've already done is painted the screws on both sides black. But I'm also going to use some metallic craft paints here, and I have a lighter silver and a darker color as well. And use that for dry brushing on some various details and stuff, and some weathering, like in here on the grip. Starting with the dark or darker of the metallic craft paint. Let me see what type it says it is. Gunmetal gray. Well, that's appropriate. So I'm starting with the gunmetal gray. Irony, irony. Yeah. And then once I put on layers like this of the darker, I will go through with some of the lighter here and just do a little highlighting and low lighting and throughout the gunmetal gray, not too much. I'm going to go throughout the blaster and repeat that as I feel from reference photos. And we'll be back for the clear coating after this. I've got this blaster hanging up here, and it is all, of course, painted, and it is now time for the final reveal. And I call this the final reveal because I feel like the clear coat really does bring out a lot of detail from some of the painting that I've done. And you can either do a matte or a gloss clear coat, but this stuff here, this Treehouse Studios clear acrylic gloss coating, is really interesting. For one thing, it doesn't have a rattle ball, which I thought that was different, but it creates a permanent water-resistant finish. And I've been using this on prop props in various videos, masks, all kinds of stuff. But this stuff does work really great. Especially on blasters and other handheld things where there's a lot of wear and tear. I end up noticing, you know, especially in the grip area, whenever I hold stuff, like Nerf blasters that I painted, it tends to wear off at a pretty decent rate if you don't clear coat it. Especially some of these acrylic paints and other things that I've done. So the clear coat is completely necessary. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and do up both sides and then let this hang and then come check it out at the end for the final. So the clear coat has had sufficient time to dry, and this is what I was talking about, especially with areas like where I airbrushed the wood. Looks pretty dull and flat until you hit it with that clear coat and give it a nice seal. Helps to make everything pop, especially like the way this barrel end here turned out. Kind of feel like just right in there, right in the center, I probably should have blended that a little bit better, but the rest of it I like pretty immensely. I'm pretty happy with how this turned out. I'm pretty excited for it. I am going to build, of course, a display stand for this, but not in this video. Happy with the way the top turned out as well. Looks really good. And of course, if I need to repair this, I can take it apart. Now it's time to see if this thing will still fire. I'm going to take this wire out of it and load it up. Okay, so the blaster is finished. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video and it gave you some ideas on some modifications for your own cosplays and your own projects. And of course this video wouldn't be complete if I didn't crack it open, load it up, and shoot a couple darts out of it. Which I have not shot this since I put it back together, but I have faith in myself that it will work. And sure enough it does. And to reissue what I said at the beginning, always make sure anytime you paint something like this so it doesn't have any orange on it. It is very dangerous to take this out in public. People may think that it is an actual firearm and not a toy, and you could get in trouble or worse. So always be careful whenever you do this. And as well, make sure and check with your conventions before you take any weapons that look ultra realistic. Some don't allow it, and like where I live, some do, but you have to show up an hour early for a check-in. Before it opens, a cosplay check-in. So always research and check all that stuff out before you bring anything. And that's pretty much it. I want to thank all the new subscribers. I appreciate it, each and every one of you. Hopefully this gives you guys some ideas and some inspiration. Hopefully all of you have a great day. And as always, thanks for watching.